In the quiet river town of Millhaven, Ohio, people still believed in paper letters. Sure, bills came by email and news came by phone, but grief still arrived in envelopes. Eli Turner had worked at the Millhaven post office for 32 years. He wasn't the postmaster, and he certainly wasn't important. He was the man who sorted the forgotten mailta envelopes with no return address. The letters smeared by rain, the packages that nobody ever claimed. On a rainy Tuesday in October, he found one that made his hands stop. The envelope was yellowed and thin, addressed in shaky blue ink, to Sarah Whitmore, Millhaven, Ohio. There was no street, no zip code, just a name. The postmark was dated 1998. Eli frowned. He had lived in Millhaven his entire life and knew most of the last names in town. Whitmore was familiar, very familiar. Because Sarah Whitmore had died 20 years ago, she had been just 16. A car accident on a patch of winter ice. The whole town had attended the funeral. Eli stared at the envelope for longer than he should have. Technically, it belonged in the undeliverable bin, destined for the dead letter office in Atlanta, to be forgotten forever. But something about the handwriting felt desperate. He slid the envelope into his jacket pocket. That night, at his kitchen table under a flickering overhead light, Eli opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. It read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, I finally found the courage. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. I never stopped loving you." D. Eli swallowed hard. No last name, just the initial D. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the wall clock ticking above the stove. Why would someone mail this in 1998, after she had already died? Unless they didn't know, or unless they just couldn't accept it. The next morning, Eli didn't put the letter back. Instead, he did something he had never done before in his career. He looked up Sarah Whitmore's old address. The house still stood on Maple Street, white siding, green shutters, a porch swing. He drove there after his shift ended. The Whitmores had moved away years ago. Everyone in town knew that. But the house had been sold. A young woman answered the door, in her late 20s, with blonde hair tied back and a baby on her hip. "Yes?" she asked. "I'm sorry to bother you," Eli said. "I work at the post office. I found something addressed to Sarah Whitmore. I know she used to live here." The woman hesitated for a moment. "That was my aunt." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "My mom's sister," she continued. "She died when she was 16. "I remember," Eli said quietly. The woman studied him carefully. "Why?" Eli handed her the old, yellowed envelope. She looked at the date on the postmark and her face went pale. "That's the year she died." "Yes," he replied. She stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Inside, framed photos lined the hallway. In one, a smiling teenage girl in a cheerleading uniform was frozen in time. "My mom never talks about her," the woman said softly. "It destroyed my grandparents." Eli cleared his throat. "Do you know anyone whose name started with D?" The woman shook her head slowly. "No. But there was always a rumor." "What kind of rumor?" Eli leaned in. "That she was going to run away." Eli felt the room tilt slightly. Run away? With someone. No one ever knew who. Silence filled the living room like smoke. Eli left an hour later, but the story wouldn't leave him. a secret lover, a letter mailed too late, a rumor of escape, and a 16-year-old girl dead on icy pavement. That night, Eli returned to the letter. He read it again and again. I finally found the courage. Courage for what? To confess love, or to admit something worse? Eli stared at the signature. Just D then. Something hit him like a splash of cold water. He had seen that handwriting before. Not in a letter, but on a parcel. Years ago, someone in Millhaven still used that same shaky blue ink. And if he was right, the man who wrote to a dead girl might still be alive, and still living in this very town. Eli folded the letter carefully. Tomorrow, he decided, he would check the old mail logs. He didn't know it yet, but by the end of the week, half of Millhaven would be whispering his name, and someone out there would wish he had burned that envelope instead. The story was just beginning. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you're as captivated by this mystery as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. See you in the next video. The next morning, Eli went straight to the back room of the Millhaven post office. He didn't waste time. He pulled out the old 1998 mail records and started flipping through them slowly. After several minutes, something caught his eye. Something familiar. Thin blue handwriting. Slightly uneven. It was the same distinct style he'd seen on the letter addressed to Sarah Whitmore. A few other envelopes from that same year had been written with that exact blue fountain pen. He traced the records, his heart beating a little faster. One of them, a local mailing, was connected to a P.O. box. Box 214. Eli knew who rented that box. Daniel Harper, the hardware store owner. A lifelong resident of Millhaven, a man everyone knew and respected. Eli closed the heavy binder and just sat there for a moment, the silence of the room pressing in on him. It wasn't proof, not by a long shot. But it was a thread, a connection that made a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. It was enough. That afternoon, the bell above the door of Harper's Hardware chimed as Eli walked in. Daniel stood behind the counter, just like he always did, arranging a box of screws. Eli, he said with a friendly, easy nod. Good to see you. What can I get for you today? But as Daniel spoke, Eli's eyes were drawn to something simple, almost insignificant, yet it felt monumental. A blue fountain pen rested beside the cash register, its silver clip gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Daniel followed his gaze and smiled. I still use those, he said, picking it up and turning it in his fingers. Always liked blue ink. Eli tried to keep his voice casual, a simple question between neighbors. Since when? He asked. Daniel's smile didn't falter. Oh, since high school, he replied, without a second thought. Eli took a quiet breath, steadying himself before he continued, watching Daniel's face for any flicker of change. It was addressed to Sarah Whitmore. For the first time, Daniel's friendly expressions softened into something else, something more somber and distant. A shadow of memory passed over his eyes. She was a good person, he said quietly, his voice losing its cheerful edge. A really good person. This was it, the opening. Did she ever talk about leaving? Eli asked, his voice gentle, not wanting to spook him. Daniel hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the window. looking out at the quiet street as if seeing a memory play out. "Sometimes," he finally replied, his voice careful, measured. "People say a lot of things when they're young. Dreams are bigger back then." There was no anger in his tone, no defensiveness, no outright denial. It was a non-answer, and that told Eli more than a confession would have. He left the store without pushing further, the chime of the bell marking his retreat. That evening, back in the quiet of his own home, Eli laid the letter out on his desk. And then he saw it. At the bottom corner, almost hidden in the texture of the paper, was a faint brown mark. It was subtle, easily missed. It looked like a smudge of dirt, or maybe dried mud. Not much. Eli leaned back in his chair, the pieces swirling in his mind. If Sarah had really been planning to leave town, if someone, possibly Daniel Harper, had written her this letter right before she died, then maybe the official story, the one Millhaven had accepted for 2 decades, wasn't the full story at all. The neat and tidy narrative of a tragic accident was beginning to unravel at the seams. Later that night, driven by a restless energy he couldn't explain, Eli went to check his mailbox. Tucked inside was a small, plain white envelope. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name, written in simple block letters. It wasn't a threat, not an overt one anyway. There was no menace, no anger. It was just a quiet message, a warning, a request, a boundary being drawn in the dark. Holding both letters in his hands, one from the past, one from the present. For 20 years, Millhaven believed it understood what happened to Sarah Whitmore. It was a closed chapter, a sad story told and retold until it became a simple fact. The past wasn't gone, it was just waiting, and it was starting to wake up. Thanks for watching. If you're hooked on this mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The past wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Eli stood in his kitchen, long after midnight, staring at 2 letters lying side by side on the table. One was written in 1998. The other was delivered tonight. Both were unsigned, and both were connected to Sarah Whitmore. He didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, hard certainty. If someone wanted the past to be left alone, it meant the past still mattered. The next morning, Eli made a decision. Instead of confronting Daniel Harper, he drove to the one place in town that held more history than memory, the public library. Millhaven's archives were small but thorough, and thankfully the old newspapers had been digitized years ago. He sat down at the computer and searched for the date of Sarah's accident. December 14th, 1998. The headline was simple and tragic. Local teen dies in winter car accident. He read the article slowly. Single vehicle. Lost control near the river bend. No witnesses. But as he got to the end, one small detail snagged his attention. Authorities responded after receiving a call at 9:17 p.m. Eli frowned. Who made that call? He kept digging, searching deeper into the archives, and found a brief follow-up article printed just 2 days later. The caller had remained unnamed but was described as a young male driver who reported seeing a car off the roadside. A young male. Eli leaned back in his chair, the pieces starting to shift. If someone saw the accident happen, or at least arrived moments after, why had no one ever mentioned it publicly? Why had the whole town only remembered it as a tragic, lonely loss? That afternoon, Eli didn't go to the hardware store as planned. Instead, he drove out to the river bend. The water moved calmly, reflecting the pale winter sky. He stood near the old guardrail, trying to imagine that night 20 years earlier. The frigid air, the dark road, a car sliding toward the edge, and somewhere nearby, another vehicle, another person. He heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. I figured you'd come here eventually. Eli turned. Daniel Harper stood a few feet away, hands buried in his coat pockets. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, weary expression. You read the articles? Daniel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Yes, Eli replied. You made the call. Daniel nodded slowly. I was there. The words hung in the cold air between them. Eli didn't interrupt. He just waited. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the river. She wanted to leave, he said, his voice soft. We both did. We were 18. It felt like this whole world was too small for us. Eli listened, hanging on every word. That night, Daniel continued, we had an argument. Not about leaving, but about the timing. I wanted to go immediately. She wanted to wait until after graduation. We were parked just up the road from here. She drove off first. She was upset. Eli's chest tightened. I followed her a few minutes later, Daniel said, his voice cracking just slightly. By the time I reached the curve, her car was already down there. He paused, the memory raw even after all these years. I called for help. I stayed right here until the sirens came, but I never told anyone we'd argued. I didn't want people thinking. I didn't want them thinking I pushed her into doing something reckless. Eli studied his face, the years of quiet grief etched into it. Why send the letter? He asked softly. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Because I never told her I loved her. Not clearly, not bravely enough. I wrote it that night after the funeral. I just couldn't bring myself to mail it. Years later, I found it in a drawer and I sent it. I don't really know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I was just looking for some kind of closure. And the second note? Eli asked, watching him closely. Daniel looked genuinely confused. What second note? Eli observed his reaction. There was no flicker of deception, no shift in his eyes. And that's when a new realization dawned on him, slowly and unnervingly. The unsigned note in his own mailbox, the one warning him to stop digging, hadn't come from Daniel Harper. Which meant someone else in this town knew the story was being reopened. Someone who preferred silence. Eli looked back at the calm, indifferent river. For 20 years, he said, this town has believed there was something hidden about that night. There wasn't, Daniel replied gently. Just two kids who thought they had all the time in the world. The wind whispered through the bare trees. After a long, quiet moment, Eli finally spoke. I won't turn this into gossip, he promised. But I think her family deserves to know she wasn't alone. Daniel swallowed hard and gave a single, grateful nod. That's fair. Weeks later, Eli drove once more to Maple Street. He handed Sarah's niece the original letter. Daniel's letter from all those years ago, and he gently explained everything he had learned. There were tears, of course, but there was also something else in the room. Relief. It wasn't a story of mystery or scandal anymore. It was just understanding. That evening, Eli returned to his quiet kitchen. The second anonymous note still bothered him, a loose thread in an otherwise finished story, but he no longer felt unsettled by it. Some people would always be afraid of old memories being reopened, but sometimes revisiting them doesn't destroy a town. Sometimes it heals it. Outside, the river flowed steadily through Millhaven, carrying the past forward instead of burying it deep in the mud. And for the first time in 20 years, Sarah Whitmore's story finally felt complete. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more.